Welcome. My name's Jim Degnan. I'm an artist and professor here in the College of Education. I chair visual arts education and founder of the Stockyard Institute. We're here tonight to welcome Aretha Sills. What a legacy. I think about it as a Chicago legacy as well. Connected directly to the Hull House. That's certainly the conceptual framework I use for the Stockyard Institute. My great-grandmother taught there. But I wanted to thank a couple people and welcome everybody here tonight. I think about the schools in Chicago, or schools of thought. It's easily understandable that it's sociology and architecture, social practice, and improvisation. It's really easy to sort of understand why that sort of works in this city. The Learning Studio, which is a project of the Stockyard Institute and the DePaul Art Museum, is us building this platform around learning, experimentation, and public pedagogy. That's our plan for this coming year. And I appreciate the museum giving me the kind of leverage and license to kind of wander how I learned, sort of improvisationally, aesthetically. So, like in keeping with how the philosophy of the Stockyard Institute works, we're going to build this around, establishing relationships. I want to thank Laura Caroline, the executive director of the museum, Unit Behar, the curator, David Marizella, scholar and archivist who's helped with many sort of projects, and welcome Aretha Sills.
Hello, my name is Erik Parsons. I'll be the other discussant this evening, and I can't tell you just how excited I am to have brought this here and to be able to do this with Jim and the Learning Studio. This is our first evening event as part of the studio and something that we are improvisationally building and co-creating together, and I'm so excited to have that. I am here at DePaul as a doctoral PhD student, currently working on my dissertation, which focuses, funnily enough, on Spolin improvisation as a means of understanding our fundamental relationship with learning and education and what that can mean for those of us who engage as educators in the community. So to that end, I can't be more excited to be able to bring this to light. I was very fortunate, what was it, a year and a half ago? About a year and a half ago, I had this crazy idea for my lit review to not just read people's stuff and write about it, but to go, hey, I wonder if I could talk to that person. So I kind of just cold dropped an email to Aretha Sills and said, hey, this is the thing that I just discovered has formulated my entire understanding of education since I started teaching. And she was so kind to share her time with me. And I cannot be more pleased to now be able to have her be able to share some of that with you. Structurally, she's got some wonderful photos and history to share a little bit to start with. And then she and I are going to sit down for a discussion. And hopefully there will be some time for some Q&A afterwards and some chatting. And I would certainly encourage anyone to contribute to this sort of little co-collaborative piece of art on the wall that we're doing tonight that is entirely improvisational. So with that, I'm going to hand things over to Aretha.
Thank you so much, Erik, and thank you, Jim, and thank you, everyone at the DePaul Art Museum and the Stockyard Institute. So delighted to be here, and thank you, perfect. I'm having an allergy attack, so just bear with me. Anyway, thank you. So delighted to be here to talk about Viola Spolin's vision of improvisation as a non-authoritarian philosophy of education. Those of you who know me know I don't stop talking about this, so I set a timer. First off, I would like to ask anyone here who's a teacher to please raise your hand. Let us see. Oh, yes. Okay. This is the kind of ratio I like. And oh, hi, Rudy. Oh, my God. Look, so many students and players and friends here. So good to see you all. And my sister Neva and my niece Freya are here. So our dad, Paul Sills, used to open his workshops by asking, all right, where are my teachers? Teachers, raise your hand. And they would raise their hands, and then he would tell them how his mother, Viola Spolin, came to create improvisational theater in the United States because she found a great teacher in a woman named Neva Boyd. My mom, Carol Sills, another great teacher, would often add to that when she would open her workshops with more about how Neva Boyd's work was so influenced by the progressive education movement that was swirling around Hull House. And so I'm going to share that same story with you right now. Let's see. Anything I forgot to mention? Anyway, alumni, we're going to go to you. I'm not oh, here we go. All right. So we'll start with this picture. This is Viola finally made the cover of Dramatics. I think it's like, this is her in the 30s. This is who we're going to discuss. And we'll start with her, the early days of her life. Viola was born here in Chicago in 1906. I think this is her high school graduation photo. There she is, a young woman, and you can see how modern she was. Viola was a first-generation American. Both of her parents were Russian Jewish immigrants and had fled a lot of trauma, and she was very much forward-thinking and progressive-minded first-generation American. In fact, take a look at this for a little bit. This is the woman we're here to discuss. Very often when we think about the past, we bring our, we color it with our idea of it. So I like to show these pictures to give you a sense of the generation that Viola was born into. This is a car. Let me show you the next picture. This is she and her girlfriends, a bunch of Russian Jewish girls, pooled their money to buy this Model A Ford, I think, and they would tool around Lake Geneva. And that's Viola on the left with the rifle there, naturally. And they all had nicknames, and her nickname was Spark, which is so appropriate because she was a spark. But she was born into a family tradition of play. Her family would play a lot of charades-type games and sing around the piano. They would make up operas, and they would improvise about, the stories that they told to each other about coming to America, and then, and then the weddings that happened there. And her whole family would be involved, and then there would be improvisations at the end, and Viola would always get up and was considered the star of the show of that part. But even before that, she was one of those kids who was sort of raised on the street, playing games. The parents were busy, so the kids were out in the street learning games from each other, making up games, finding abandoned construction lots to play in, and creating dangerous games with the abandoned equipment there and stuff like that. She really loved to play. She went to, was it Lakeview High School? Here, anyone familiar with that one? She was a great, this is according to her, but I believe her, a great basketball player and a great baseball player, but not such a great student. In fact, her grades were not good enough for her to get into drama club. So she did not get her theater education in high school. But luckily for her, oh, hold on just a second. The other thing about Viola as a child is that she was born putting on shows. When she put on her first play with her friends at 8 years old, and she charged a penny or 10 pins. And here's a picture of her and her girlfriends in high school with their, fake cigarettes and their banjo and boys in sailor pants and all that, whatever's going on in the background. That was Viola. She was a lot of fun. But luckily, so her high school wasn't a great learning experience for her, but luckily for her, after high school, her sisters, two of her sisters, took her to go see Neva Boyd at Hull House. Neva Boyd was a group worker, a creative group worker. We now call that a social worker. She her background was in early childhood education. And she became a social worker and a very important in the training of social workers later. And she believed in the uses and the power of play as an educational force, but also as a therapeutic force in terms of the social work she was doing, the group work. Viola worked with her for 3 years at her recreational training school at Hull House, which was sometimes at Hull House, sometimes in Miss Boyd's house. And here she is. And Viola, for 3 years, Viola learned from her every type of game you could possibly imagine. Kentucky running races, tabletop games, square dances, other folk dances, storytelling, anything from the oral tradition that was passed down. Storytelling, she considered that an educational tool. And so she was educating primarily young women to go out into the community and work with groups using play. And Neva Boyd would travel the world gathering games and publishing them in chapbooks. And she also, I have a copy of her handbook of recreational games here that I'll share with you. A book all my players know we use this a lot in class. That was for her students to use in recreational centers and with any of the people that they were working with. She argued that play is common to all cultures. It's an educational and healing force. She, in her theory of play, she wrote about how play develops social values as does no other behavior. Because when children are left to their own devices and they're getting up a game and they're working it out, you'll notice they have a lot of disagreements, right? Or you'll remember. There are a lot of disagreements about who's going to play what role and how it's all going to work and, who gets to do what. But they will work it out because they share the common goal to keep the play going. Right? Not because an adult told them to, not because it's the right thing to do, because they want to play. And so in this way, she believed that play could do all sorts of wonderful things for the human being, and it's a healing and liberatory force. And play brings out the best in our nature. So she was training all these young women like Viola to go into the community and work with groups using play. Viola married her first husband, Wilmer, and during that time, and had our dad, Paul, in 1927. So let me share. I'll give you that picture later. All right. I'm gonna go back a little bit to Jane to talk about Hull House. Who here in this group, I would imagine, people know a little bit about Hull House, right? I see. And do some folks not know about Hull House? Oh my God, this is the first. This is great. All right. Sometimes I even ask, did you know there was a progressive era in the United States? And they're like, what? Okay, great. So we'll skip all that. But here's the great Jane Addams, a co-founder of Hull House. I love this picture of her. And so what I'll mention was Hull House for the recording of this, just a little bit about Hull House. It was a social settlement on Halsted Street, and she and her partner, Ellen Gates Starr, had wonderful progressive ideas about integrating the new immigrants into the United States into to a democratic culture through education and the arts, and they set up all sorts of programs and social services, and it was really an amazing force in Chicago from 1890 to the peak was in the 30s, but Hull House remained active as a social services organization, I think, until about 2012, when they were totally public funded at that time, and they lost their funding. So she was an incredibly inspiring figure, and she was a public intellectual, she was an activist. So many laws of the 20th century that protect workers and protect children, and created compulsory education, playgrounds, stuff we really, garbage men coming through the street, public health. So many laws that we've taken for granted until recently, right, were because of the activism that was created in her wake at Hull House. She really knew how to bring people together and get them talking and working together. And so she argued that democracy requires social ethics. It requires us to get out of our own spheres, out of our own comfort zones, and meet people who are not like us. And get to know their needs and concerns. And in this way, she said we must all turn out for each other and get to know the size of one another's burdens and walk the common road. That is social ethics to her. And when Neva Boyd is saying that play develops social values, right? She's in direct conversation with Jane Addams saying, you know what does this? Play. I will. There's so much more to say on this, but I got to keep moving. And I want you all to go to Hull House Museum if you haven't. So much wonderful stuff there, many wonderful resources there. And here's a wonderful picture of in 1927, Viola had her first son, Paul. That is our dad, Paul, on Neva Boyd's lap, drinking at the mother's milk of play, and how wonderful that this transmission, this photo of the transmission of the history exists. There's an amazing story about Neva Boyd, too, where she was a proponent of, recreational activities, of playgrounds, and she was at a school, and she saw that the construction crews had come to tear up trees and take them out, and they were tearing up all the trees out of the school's playground area, and she was so sad and upset, but she didn't know what to do about it. Then she sat on steps like this. The story, she sat on the steps of the school, and some kids showed up, and she started telling them a folk tale. And when she was done, one of the kids said to her, "Can we come to where you teach?" So that was Neva Boyd, a very important figure. So Viola, after she had Paul, check this out. She had her second son, Bill, very quickly. So she wasn't able to work for a while. She wasn't able to go into the community. She had two sons and got divorced like that. Like I said, she was a very modern person. Nothing held her back. So she had two young sons, but she was really determined to get a theater education that she had always dreamed of. And so she came to DePaul's night school. And here she is, Viola Sills, who will take the role made famous by the late Mrs. Fisk in DePaul play tonight. So there she is. She has a noted role. And she also went to New York to study with the group theater. She was studying Stanislavski and early versions of the method there. But also here in Chicago, there were a lot of Russian emigres. So Viola was a divorced single mom. She was getting her self-education in any way she could in the theater. There's a lot of more wonderful pictures on our website, violaspolin.org, beautifully designed by my sister Neva, and there's some amazing pictures of some of her projects during that period. eventually she was able, I one story first, though, that she told Jeffrey Sweet, the theater historian. She wasn't able to work in that period, but she was able to invite her girlfriends over to the house. So she would prop her baby Paul up on the bed and play games with all her fabulous, hilarious girlfriends, some of whom you saw pictures of, and in her apartment on Saturday nights. And she said that's where she thinks the roots of Second City were, from Paul watching her fabulous girl, for the baby on the bed. That's what she said. But finally she was able to work. Neva Boyd got her a job with the WPA, the Works Project Administration. At the end of the Depression, they were putting America to work and hiring artists. And she made $30 a week or something. She ran through the streets, I'm rich. But it was her job to create programs and to gather the kids and get them playing. And here she is on the Hull House stage. You can see that she is teaching them, she's directing them in a show. So when she was working with kids, because of her love for the theater, she was teaching dramatics. So she was putting on plays with kids that basically, as she said, she would round up off the street. So the minute before, they had been playing Hi-Ho Silver on the street. She'd say, hey, come in and play on the stage. And they'd play that till she finally got them to do something else and some other games. And then that's how she was sent to institutions who had asked for someone to come in. So she was working with all kinds of groups, orphans, sex workers, Christian groups, any group that needed her. She asked for someone to come around. That's who she was working with, what she called everyday people. Later she called her. So she was teaching theater, dramatics, to people who had no experience, and the language of the theater that she had learned was meaningless to them. So here she is putting on a play. Obviously, you can see Paul Sills in the center, in the short pants, up on that riser. She's directing her son there. And let's see, there is, this is an amazing document of a performance that she did at Hull House, where she was really starting to develop theater games and really getting her young players to improvise. She was putting on shows, but she realized, and she was teaching theater, but she realized every time she had a problem that she wanted to explain to her students, because of her training at Hull House and her belief in experiential education, she did not want to tell them how to do it. So she decided to create a game. And within that game was the kernel of the theater knowledge that they needed. That through playing the game, through experience, they would learn what they needed to learn about communicating in the theater. No lectures needed. So every time she had a problem, she would create a new game. Thanks to Neva Boyd, she figured out what could help her work with everyday people. So this is an article. They're totally amazed, aimed at stirring the creative ability inherent in all children. This is, September 22nd, 1940. It's a program of unorthodox drama that hews to no lines, knows no cues, and never heard of a rehearsal. The youngsters are given a bare idea, characters are chosen, and the impromptu play begins. It's fun, stimulates reading, eliminates the dis, dat, and does from the children's speech. Are these young thespians good? They're the finest ad-libbers the stage has seen, says director Viola Spolin. And it goes on to sort of describe some of what they were doing. They're behaving as if they were in an air raid. They're responding to contemporary events. There's one where the landlord is coming to knock on the door and demand some money. Viola always said her students at Hull House were the first improvisers to take suggestions from the audience. So you can find this on our website and read more about it. It's wonderful. These neighborhood kids are getting reviews and stuff in here. They're sort of knocking the costumes. What, they have costumes at all is amazing. We don't get costumes anymore in improvisational theater. So it's just a wonderful document of the work that she was doing there. There's more. Here she is. This is a few years later, about 1946. After the war, she moved to Los Angeles and opened her Young Actors Company in Hollywood. Let me see if I can, going ahead a little bit. So I wish I had some pictures. There's some pictures on the website of her work there. Again, she didn't want to lecture her students. She was putting on plays. It was a children's repertory theater and an acting school. She, again, every time she had a problem imparting that something she needed to impart to her players, the way a director would normally tell them what to do, she created a game. And so she kept working on her system, and she realized she was really developing what she called a non-authoritarian, non-psychological actor training method. And nonverbal, because at Hull House, imagine, there's people speaking a lot of different languages, right? And games cross those barriers easily. So here's her son, Paul, all grown up, so he's probably in his 20s here. He was, like you saw, born into this world, and never knew any other form of theater. And he just like sort of came out putting on shows, and this is around the days of the Playwrights Theater Club here in Chicago, which was one of the first off-loop theaters, and it was a repertory theater, and they were putting on a classic a week with students who had all met at University of Chicago. Some famous names don't have time for some of them, but out of that came the Compass Players. He was the founding director of the Compass Players and the founding director of Second City. And here he is, smoking again. We never knew him to smoke, though, right? He quit before we knew him. But here he is at Second City in the early 60s, and he was an owner and founder of Second City. And let's see, this is a nice photo there of, that's Paul here. I love this photo because Viola's on the left. She's not often included in these pictures, and our mom, Carol Sills, is on the upper left with the great improviser Severin Darden there. Lots of wonderful folks in this picture. Paul stayed at Second City until 1965, and he sold his share because he was interested in responding to the political events of the time. And one of the things he said about that is that the soul of the American people is beyond satire. At that moment, he wanted something different. But Viola was the workshop leader at Second City quite a bit for the company, but also for for kids and teens and anyone. This is a teen workshop, and it looks like they're doing London Bridge or some other wonderful game there. After Second City, Paul and Viola founded the Game Theater, 1935, North Sedgwick, and you can see they were playing theater games with the community, and you can start to see that you see in the logo players, audience. Viola's theory of audience as fellow player made vivid there. And the Game Theater was a community space. This is Viola working there. They had all sorts of political activists there. There was a nursery school there. There was a bar and a neighborhood theater. On all sorts of amazing stuff happened there. Here's Paul. And I bring it up because a lot of people don't know about the history of this theater and like to share that. Paul at the Game Theater, you can see those hands are shaping space. And here's a spacewalk. The audience is doing a spacewalk. And can you see Roger Ebert on the left there? So we found this on a contact sheet, and my mom sent it to his wife. She said, "Yep, that's him." So this was the kind of neighborhood joint it was, you know. And that led to story theater. Paul was created story theater out of the theater games and the work he did there. And this is the Broadway cast of story theater, where he adapted Grimm's fairy tales for the stage without a narrator and with no props, using the transformational space of Spolin work. And that there story theater is, and here is Ovid's Metamorphosis on Broadway. This is Io, I think, the myth of Io. And here he is at Piper's Alley. He had a learning theater behind Second City in the early 80s. And he is doing more story theater here. He said, "I am a son of Hull House," right? It was through Viola's work with Neva Boyd that he came into contact with stories and folk dancing and play and fairy tales, and he said that stood him on good stead in his journey. Right? He created many, many theatrical forms, and all of his work, he would tell us, came directly out of his mother's work. Honor thy mother, he would tell us. So this is the last, the last image I'll share with you of Viola in 1968. This was her. She went on she was very, she published her book Improvisation for the Theater, her first book. I'll share that. In 1963, after working with the professional companies at Second City. She said it gave her new insight into the work she had done. Oh, there, we got one back there too. All right, people brought their copies. She has many more books. You can find a complete list of her publication on our website, violaspolin.org, and a bio with more photos. She called her work kindergarten for the 21st century. She sort of knew that her time was coming. And people didn't quite get how important this work was yet. And she was a deep believer in the what Neva Boyd taught her about play being a healing force. She was working with incarcerated people. She was working with people who were in hospitals and throughout her life. And so I will leave you with my favorite quote of hers. Is she said, "My vision is a world of accessible intuition." And I will leave you with that thought. Thank you. Are we going over there?
Moving over.
All right.
So now we get to the chatty part where I start waxing philosophical about education. But as you can see, I was kind of shocked because Viola Spolin's book was required for us to buy as theater students and undergrad. We mostly focused on a lot of the games, and it wasn't until actually recently that I really started reading through what she actually had to say. And you'll notice I've got all these little notes. It's only about 30 pages in which she just totally lays out just this phenomenal philosophy. And she's not remotely holding anything back, as you'll see. And on that note, you shared a quote right there at the end. So I decided tonight when we were kind of thinking about this symposium, what we would do is to use her quotes as a way of introducing kind of the things we want to talk about tonight. And I have this secret as a teacher. I always overfill my agenda because some people think that improvisers, that you don't plan, and it's not that. It's you provide a structure and that you are willing and able to move. And for me, by putting a whole mess of things on my agenda, then it's really easy to go, I don't need this part right now. And I still have something to draw on and to work on and to engage with my students. Hopefully we'll get through a good bit of it. we'll dive in. This was, I don't know how many of you saw when you signed up the RSVP. We included this in our info page and sort of press release, and just love this quote as a start.
I just want to mention
Yeah.
one thing. There's a letter in Viola's papers from her first editor who was asking her to cut all of the philosophy. He said, "No one." It's literally quote, "No one cares about your philosophy. Viola, get to the work." And it's really such a good thing for all of us that she was a really tough lady.
Yeah. Otherwise, I wouldn't have a dissertation.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
So, I wanted to kind of kick off with this because this is one of those things that, I quite literally grew up backstage in the theater. My dad was a director. My mom was a choreographer. I have memories of everybody in my family except me being in Sound of Music at the same time, with my mother playing Liesel and my oldest brother, playing Friedrich. Because my mom is 5'2" with the wind at her back. But the thing that really struck me, and it took me a while to come to, was that when I first started teaching, I just was intuitively applying my training in theater, and particularly my improvisation training, to the way in which I engaged with students. And with that, this I think encapsulates sort of the big aha, the big idea of theater is communication, and arguably all art. Here we are in this museum. All art in and of itself is communication. As my dad would always say, he'd say, if it doesn't communicate something, it's not art. That was the bar, right? It had to have some sort of communication. Now, we can argue all day about what communication matters and how that works and who gets to decide, but that's not what we're here for. We learn through experience and experiencing, and no one teaches anyone anything. This is as true for the infant moving from kicking to crawling to walking as it is for the scientist with equations.
I think it's important to here, you're going to read the next part.
Yeah.
I always want to read the first part of that, too.
Yeah, do you want to come back
ahead.
to the first part?
The first part, the very first words of improvisation for the theater are everyone can act, everyone can improvise, anyone who wishes to can learn to play in the theater and become stage worthy. And then this, so play, experience, learn to Viola are total synonyms.
Yeah.
They mean exactly the same thing. But yeah, this...
And this is where I get really excited in terms of explaining what it is. Because if you go like, well, as an educator, you're supposed to interact with people through play and be an equal and all of this, and we're going to get rid of this authoritarian BS. And then people kind of look at you like, well, then what do I do? And this is the part where I talk, that at least means a lot to me, is this idea of, as a teacher within any sort of structural situation, you're building an environment that creates the space for learning, and that you are, a gardener, a cultivator of an environment, as opposed to somebody who is doing something to these kids. So the idea of this, if the environment permits it, anyone can learn whatever they choose to learn, and if the individual permits it, the environment will teach everything it has to teach. And I don't know that that's always, I think we still learn a lot from terrible environments. And we also sometimes fail to learn from really great environments if we don't permit the environment to teach us. And honestly, I feel like a big part of why that happens is because we're so used to, especially as kids, we have our agency taken away from us so often that we start to act in bad faith. And we come into spaces going, I don't want what you're selling me. And I feel like I've been rambling on this, and I'll let you kind of chime in before we move on.
Well, there's so much in the first few paragraphs of her philosophy in there.
Yeah, this is literally the first paragraph.
The first few paragraphs of the book, and didn't even and then she goes on from there to sort of explain how to create that environment, I would just like to point out, I think it's still very radical, this idea that talent or lack of talent have little to do with it. She goes on to say, what we really need to do is open up our capacity for experiencing, right? And that's the role of the teacher. So in her system, there is no teacher. It's a side coach. It's a fellow player. There's some funny quotes. I don't know if we get that one later. Once she said, I wasn't, about her young actors company, she was interviewed and she said, well, I wasn't interested in having students. I was interested in having a peer group. I mean, she's working with 8-year-olds. So she wanted to get in there with them and work on these theater problems,
And I want to toss in one more thing because I'm involved with all these crazy, heady, ed philosophy people. Vygotsky, if you read Vygotsky's stuff and about the idea of children learn by being a head taller than themselves, meaning that they don't know what they're doing until they do it. They haven't mastered the technique till they believe, and they pretend. And we do this all the time. We pretend that we are more capable at something until we're actually capable at it. And one of the things he discusses, and that becomes this thing that gets talked about a lot but is not really understood, is the zone of proximal development, right? And what we call the MKO, the more knowledgeable other, right? And one of the things I love to disabuse my fellow educators is the more knowledgeable other is oftentimes your own student for you. Right? And as Bill Ayers says, we are the students of our students. And we can't just make assumptions about what our students bring into the room with them and what brilliance and perspectives and experiences that they are drawing from without engaging with them and building relationships. I very much see this constructivist modality of learning and these fundamental ideas of education very present here. And we'll get on further about where I'm going with that. So I'm actually going to show you a bunch of slides here because, and I think I'm in probably a pretty solid crowd for this, but I often run into pushback when I talk to educators, and Aretha, I'm sure you do too. And I'll tell, I've been telling other teachers, I'm like, the number one thing you could do to really help what you do and bring joy to your teaching is go do some improv. And they almost always go, no, I don't think I'd be very good at that. That's terrifying.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, that's why you need to do it. And the other part is that they're like, but that's theater. And going back to that first quote of like, well, theater is communication. What is teaching if not communication? Right? And so I underlined these words, or I should have underlined acting. But one of the things that I find fascinating about the way Viola talks, honestly, if you replace theater with anything education related, it still makes complete sense. And to me, it's not a reach. And I would actually invite you to consider and think about some of these quotes where if you would be like, no, I'm not sure. I feel like that's more of a theater thing than an education thing. I love having those dialogues. But, I put this in as, art. And then creative expression. These are things that we can learn. And that this sentence still reads. It doesn't feel, to me, I don't know about you, but it doesn't feel like shoehorning. And then literacy. And you'll notice down here, it's hard to see, but I'm gonna touch on this because when we start talking about literacy and stuff, people get, frankly, very ableist. And as a neurodivergent person working with neurodivergent students, I want to be really clear that when I say, when we're talking about the average as well as the talented, I think this is the most disparaging thing I could ever say is, well, maybe you're just at an average spot in terms of your ability to immediately cognate about this, but we can improve on that as opposed to working from a deficit mindset. So writing, math, mathematical processes, techniques of science, critical thinking, problem solving. She has an entire chapter on problem solving as part of her process. And then I come to this, where if you just swap in the word teaching, and I put I choose techniques of connection, because to me that's where the teaching actually happens. That's where education happens, because again, I'm that crazy Vygotskian guy who believes that all education is social. Did you want to add anything before we move on?
I would mention that when people are afraid of the theater and improv, often it's a misunderstanding of what we're doing there, right? And so certain kinds of comedy improv can be very terrifying. But in general, we're starting with sensory. I always tell them we're just playing games. We start with sensory awareness games and communication games and all kinds of children's games until suddenly you're flying about the space doing it, there is a difference that sometimes needs to be acknowledged at this point in history between Spolin's work and contemporary improv.
Yeah, and that actually, I will say, part of when we were talking through doing the dialogue for my lit review, one of the big things that came out of that is I've always used improv and improvisation interchangeably. And I thought it was fascinating the way that you kind of stopped me there and went, no, Viola didn't call it improv. She always called it improvisation, because she was referring to this philosophy, to this process. And if you want to, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I that distinction between improv as this sort of performance mode, right? This modality when you go to the improv and all those, it is specifically a performance approach, or that we associate with comedy and sketch and all that.
And it is improvisation for the theater. This was, for training people in the theater. And improvisational theater was a result of that. So yeah, there's a transmission that changed over time. Fair enough, but they're not the same thing. And I don't always think that every improv method has the same benefits as an educational method. And so I would just
Well, and actually, I think that brings it, I feel, so she talks extensively about this idea of connecting with intuition, as with that quote.
Yeah.
And this is part of my experience, was that, because I had been doing this as a kid, and I had, I had been part of a sketch comedy group that I helped do that was doing political sketch comedy in middle school. And that we were doing these things, and I had just internalized so much of this. And I would never consider myself like a particularly great improviser. I still have difficulty kind of allowing myself to kind of get into that zone. And but even so, I found when I just started teaching just to make a few bucks on the side, that this intuitive understanding was built in a way that my fellow teachers didn't have. I love this one. Experiencing is penetration into the environment, total organic involvement with it. This means involvement on all levels, intellectual, physical, and intuitive. Of the three, the intuitive, most vital to the learning situation, is neglected.
Yeah. Do you go further with this one?
Oh, yes, I do. That's why it says
that
continued there.
Yeah. But this is this is a little later, right? This comes a little later in the book. I think.
No. Yeah, it does.
No, but that's okay.
But it's in the same page.
Yeah.
I jumped a little bit.
What I want to mention about that is that every theater game has a focus. And we always come back to the focus. And the focus gets us out of the head and into the space, as Viola said. And so it's a practice that we can, that helps us get into this organic way of experiencing a problem and of problem solving. The other thing I want to mention about that is from the very first exercise in improvisation for the theater, exposure, Viola is letting us understand where you have half the group go in front of the group and just get stared at, and then say, well, how did that feel? What happened in your body, not how did it feel? Forgive me. And they'll say, oh, I felt, my stomach got flutters, my hands got sweaty, and then you have them count the ceiling tiles or the light fixtures or the floorboards, and all of that goes away, and they become themselves while being looked at. They enter the present time because they've got something to do. And she says that something to do is a focus. And each game is going to have a focus that's going to help you into that state. And what's really happening is being looked at is an activator of the nervous system, the fight or flight response, or freeze or fawn or what have you. And focus regulates the nervous system, and play regulates the nervous system in many ways. And so why that's so important, when that's removed from the improvisational theater pedagogy, this is why it's important.
Yeah. I don't think
Did people read through to the
yeah,
end?
did everybody get a chance?
Yeah.
By the way, I'm going to say I will do my best to kind of clean up these slides just a little, and then we'll make them accessible to everybody who comes tonight, and along with the video as well. So you should be able to get all of these. And you'll know anywhere you see that it's just a page number, you assume it's from this book, even though there's other materials of hers to draw upon.
Well, someone should read it aloud for the people who need it read aloud.
Oh,
Would you
sure.
go right ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah.
To keep the word intuitive from becoming a catch-all word, which we throw around or use for old concepts, use it to denote that area of knowledge which is beyond the restrictions of culture, race, education, psychology, and age. Deeper than the survival dress of mannerisms, prejudices, intellectualisms, and borrowings most of us wear to live out our daily lives. Let us rather embrace one another in our basic humanness and strive in the workshops to release the humanness in ourselves and our students.
I mean, this is where getting to the intuition changes everything about how we relate to each other as human beings. And so we can enter into the same space and play together in that space. And I've seen it. It happens.
Well, and I feel like
regularly.
This is really revealing of how inclusive she is, and genuinely inclusive, and what we would say equitable as opposed to equalistic, because I think this is a really, for those of you in the neurospicy end of the world, we've started talking about this idea of masking, right? And this conception of, like, particularly for those of us who are neurodiverse, we live in a world that isn't really built for us, and that we have to present ourselves constantly in a way that aligns with the expectations of people whose neurology is just fundamentally different than ours. And so this idea here where she says that, like, she's telling us that this is a space to, like, take off that mask. And I will say there's a lot of neurodiversity in the theater, and there's a lot of neurodiversity in the improv classes.
Sure, yeah. That's what makes it so fun.
Playing allows a person to respond, getting to what you were saying, playing allows a person to respond with their total organism within the total environment. The need for players to see themselves and others, not as students or teachers, but as fellow players, playing on terms of peerage, no matter what their individual ability, eliminating the roles of teacher and student, help players get beyond the need for approval, disapproval, which distracts them from experiencing themselves and solving the problem.
Yeah, so she's starting to get into her theory of approval, disapproval here. She says that, a teaching method based on play can't have a traditional authoritarian model of critique, right? In order to play, we must be free to do so, she says. And so approval, disapproval is part of that, and that not using language that either approves, good girl, or disapproves, bad girl, but use language that opens us up to the experience. See and be seen. Feel your feet with your feet, use your wear. So part of this, there's a wonderful chapter in here, a section of the chapter on creative experience called Approval, Disapproval that everyone should read. We often feel it's only us who is bound up in needing approval from our authorities in our life. And it's not, it's everyone, because this is an authoritarian culture. It's the water that we're swimming in, as my dad used to say. And so we have to sort of learn how to disentangle ourselves from that need. But this is a method that can really help, because the evaluation methods are where that happened. They're different in Spolin. Instead of saying, what did they do right? What did they do wrong? What did they do good? What did they do bad? What did you see? What was, was the space object communicated? Did they show the hot or cold? What, and then you move on. Who were they? What were they doing there? Simple as that. And then you move on. And this is very baffling to first-time students. They're completely thrown by this. Like, what's happening here? But gradually, you can let them in on this, and they'll begin to understand. It's a method they can use in their own lives to help free them from the internalized authoritarian.
Yes. And I will say, this is the kind of thing that also, like, when you get into the, the big heady, doctoral work in education, and you start reading Freire and Bell Hooks. By the way, if you haven't read Bell Hooks, fix your life. No, she's amazing, and it will just be, it's really inspiring. But it's funny, they very much talk about this very similar thing, even though they're coming from a different perspective. There is this sense of parallel development of non-authoritarian approaches that have these improvisational elements that are so essential to what Spolin's talking about. And to me, that feels, Spolin just provides this particularly accessible into those of us who've been reading Dewey and Adams and looking at these like theories of progressive education and understanding what that is. But Bell Hooks talks about the way that part of what I was inspired by there is that she talks about the way that people push back when you give them this liberatory event and you don't give them approval and disapproval.
Yeah.
And I will tell you, as a high school teacher, and particularly as a sub, I work as a substitute teacher, so I teach everything in the building, and there's 3,700 students in the building. And I'm constantly running into kids who are like, they're working on a worksheet kind of thing, right, that day because I'm the sub, and they need to be able to plan for somebody who doesn't know how to teach, or doesn't know the subject, right? But so often they're just like, but what's the answer? What do I put down in order to get the grade? And I'm like, well, what do you think is the answer? What do you know, and what are you drawing upon? And then we can talk about how we get closer to what the expectation might be. And they don't like that. They don't. Okay, so we have to
At
keep
first,
moving.
yeah.
Yes. No. And once you kind of break through,
then
and that's
they're
how I end up
thrilled.
with kids who find me in the hallway every day and go, you. And it makes me so happy. Okay, I don't know why we kept picking such long ones, but I will continue to read.
You can just skip some. You've got the.
The problem-solving technique used in workshop gives mutual objective focus to teacher and student. In its simplest terms, it is giving problems to solve problems. It does away with the need for the teacher to analyze, intellectualize, dissect a student's work on a personal basis. This eliminates the necessity of the student having to go through the teacher or the teacher having to go through the student to learn. It gives both of them direct contact with the material, thereby developing relationship rather than dependencies between them. It makes experiencing possible and smooths the way for people of unequal backgrounds to work together. Did you want to jump in here? I feel like this sort of reiterates a lot of what we've already touched on.
Yeah, no, I did.
She doesn't pull punches.
It's the process of solving a problem that creates, I'm going to muff that quote, so we're going to move on.
Okay.
But
Yeah. I will say
that releases
yes.
intelligence, talent, and genius. It's the process of solving a problem that releases. That's Viola. She was very careful with her words, and she chose them so that they didn't become cages.
Yeah, and I underlined this just because, like, if you're out on teacher talk and stuff, one of the biggest, every now and then there's a certain key word that teachers get told, like, this is the most important thing. And of course, differentiation was one of the big ones back in the day. And I took a whole class in differentiation, and the book spent half the book trying to explain to me that maybe I should differentiate. that I might need to teach different kids as if they're different people. And I was like, I already do this.
Yeah.
But the thing is right now the big thing is, like, build relationships. And so often teachers are like, yeah, they didn't train us how to do that. I wasn't in an education program, and guess what? I got trained in how to do that. Okay. Equality, not to be confused with sameness, is the right of everyone of any age or background to become part of the theater community. Enter into its activities, view its problems, work on them. The right to gain knowledge, the right to knock on any door.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite quotes of Viola's. I mean, I think that's her philosophy in a nutshell, and I think it speaks to where she was ahead of the pack,
Yeah.
right? Why we're kind of only now beginning to understand her, and that, including the intuition and focus and those things that sort of seemed a little far out a few years ago. Also, why her work fell out of use in the improv world in Chicago for parts of the 20th century.
That's, if you want the big tipping point of where we lost the progressive educational mentality, because back in the 70s, there was very much a real presence of progressive education. But I'll tell you, it's rare. I have a hard time meeting teachers who even have master's degrees who've ever engaged with Dewey or Adams or Montessori or all these, or much less Freire, or even Hooks. Yeah, Paulo Freire, yeah. It sounds like, and I just want to be sure I'm getting this, that one of the concerns that you have is that, Spolin is not connected oftentimes even among improvisational training, much less in anything education. If you want to take just a second before we move on.
Well, there is a whole field of creative dramatics that
Yeah.
it has a whole origin that doesn't involve Spolin, but some things came up around the same time. But she's her work was always done in drama education at every level, K through grad. Has been done this whole time. It did lose favor, in the 80s and 90s and 2000s in Chicago because other schools became prominent, and frankly, Paul and Viola weren't here. I mean, there were people here teaching their own methods that are have their roots in Spolin, but were significantly different, and also with a goal of improv comedy. But she is, in drama therapy. She's a founding mother of that field, and so her work has certainly been done.
Yeah.
And her books have been in print. All of her books are in print since they were published starting in 1963.
I mean, the most
and
recent,
were the biggest sellers at Northwestern.
Most recent edition is 99, right?
Yeah, that's the most recent edition.
They haven't, and there's relatively few things that you really need to change. Although I think there's some gendered language that definitely needs, and you'll notice I put in they, them instead of she or he.
Yeah, I do that when I read as well. But for sure, women in the 20th century, and she really didn't get, I think, enough credit, like a lot of women in the 20th century, for the effect that her work has had, because it's really at the it's at the foundations of improvisational theater, but also devised theater, ensemble theater, and educational theater, and the stuff that a teaching artist is doing. They don't even know where it comes from, but it comes from here. But also Neva Boyd, she needs to be included in that. Neva Boyd's work as well.
Yeah, I hadn't, until we talked, I hadn't really encountered Neva Boyd, because I'd only just kind of started looking at Spolin, because I was like, well, I have to include this thing that I did in my training, and then that ended up being kind of the big focus, because again, like, I came across dissertations on improvisation for educators that literally never mentioned Spolin. And I even had dialogues with those people, with one of them, and she was like, oh yeah, it was the thing. All of my experience had been through these sort of iterations of the comedy sports and all these kind of other things. And that is one of the things, is like, so much of the structures of what we know as improvisation have their roots in these games here. And it's just that people don't necessarily attribute them. And we do have to keep moving. And
Yeah, you got your eye on the time?
Man, this is where I love that she's just spitting fire, and we're not going to stop more than to kind of read these, because we've already talked about this at length.
Yeah.
I love Paul's quote of hers here. This is Paul quoting her. Authoritarians lean on discipline and goals. Involvement is goal. Discipline is involvement. And I love that. The language and attitudes of authoritarianism must be constantly scourged if the total personality is to emerge as a working unit. And constant self-surveillance is necessary on the part of the teacher, director, to eradicate it in themselves so that it will not enter the teacher-student relationship. I'll tell you, this is the one I quote the most to people when they're like, what do you mean? And I'm like, she's like out there on this.
So the thing that I want to add to that is that for Viola, the goal is to get past what the teacher knows and get into the unknown, right? She once said, what a teacher and a 6-year-old are facing is the same thing. It's the unknown. And she knew innately, and it was so important to her, that we have to get beyond what the culture knows. We have to get into an area that the intuition allows that is transformative. You know, the heart of improvisation is transformation. Otherwise, we're just repeating the same terrible tropes we learn from the culture, right? Old ideas, cliches, and those include racism and sexism and homophobia and all sorts of other things we don't need to be doing. And so for her, this is essential for that, to get us into a complete beyond, blowing wide open what anyone in the group knows, transcending it.
Well, and I will say, I think this is one of those things that's one of the most lost aspects of improv. Because when you hear the stories of Tina Fey and Amy Poehler and all these folks, and Gilda Radner, and it's like, wow, these amazing, funny women who yet found the space of improv theater to be definitely a boys' club, right? And hearing stories of, quote unquote, titans of the field who would force the players to accept some of the most regressive prompts from the audience, because that's the first prompt that came up. And it's, and thus being like, oh no, you have to be a player who has zero boundaries. And within a authoritarian culture, it's a lot easier to not have a bunch of boundaries when everybody's kind of never really pushing your boundaries, right? As a, blonde-haired white dude. I can speak to that experience to some, and so we're gonna, performance is confused with learning, end result with process. No matter to what extent the need for spontaneity and the taboo of the planned how are stressed, the taboo of the planned how are stressed, it is a very difficult point to grasp and will require constant clarification for everyone.
So a little bit, explaining that a little bit in terms of what we would do in workshop, we would choose a who, what, where, and have a focus, and that's it. So you're going to divide the group into teams, and they choose a who, what, where, usually a family relationship or a close relationship, and then the what is a specific place, and where, and the what's a physical activity, and then that's it. Because everyone wants to choose a plot, but they're getting divorced, or someone got murdered, or whatever complicating things that we learn from television, that kind of thing. And Viola's like, nope, no how. You never, or how are we going to make our way from this to this if we start off married and we end up divorced? You don't need, everything will emerge through the focus and the who, what, where if you stay out of it. Everything you need will emerge. And one of the themes of her work is that the environment has everything you need if you let it. And so this is, again, it's always about process and not performance. And wonderful performance does come out of this work. However, it gets there through process. And we always have to be reminding ourselves it's okay to just be playing for the sake of play, and experiencing for the sake of experiencing, and learning for the sake of learning, rather than have an event in mind, because the event in mind will make us feel cheated when we get there, right? So that's what.
And I do want to push on because we don't have as much. We haven't been able to. I had other quotes that I wanted to add that I had to cut out. But this
just read the whole book.
I know, right? We'll just go full Andy
audiobook here.
Andy Kaufman.
I don't have
just come up and be like, I'm going to read this book. But the how, this thing of like, we have the who, the where, the what, but we don't decide what the how is. And I will say this is the biggest issue I have with education and curriculum, is so much of it is, if you have the best lesson plan ever, if you have a fully detailed lesson plan, and which is the how of every single, like, you're supposed to come down, if anybody's done it recently, they want you to track, like, we're going to do this for 2 minutes. I'm going to do this for 3 minutes.
Yeah.
I mean, and I'm not, this is not hyperbole, right? And so much of, especially if you've taken the stupid test, yes, EdTPA, so much of it is focused on this, like, content first, followed by relationship and actual understanding and cognition, right? That really, this is the thing that we're fighting back against so much. And then just and I'm going to kind of rock it through, because I just kind of said this just now. The pre-planning is necessary only to the extent that the problem should have a structure. The structure is the where, who, and what, plus the focus. It is the field upon which the game is played that is pre-planned. How the game will go can be known only when the players are out on the field. And leave it to a dyed-in-the-wool theater person to come up with a sports analogy.
She was an athlete,
yeah,
for sure.
And we are quickly running out of time, so we're going to get to this last
the Q&A.
slide. Yeah, and I want to end with this, because I feel, for my fellow teachers out there, how often upon viewing demonstration and lectures on the theater have we thought, the words are right, the principle's correct, the result is wonderful, but how can we do it? And anybody who sat through a PD session as a teacher, you've had amazing PD sessions. And the other part to me is when you get into, doctoral work, and they're like, read this book and that book and this book, and read this paper and that paper, and read this study and this. Have you read Laborie? Have you read Al? Have you read, do you know what Taylorism is? What about, what about? Right? And all of these things. And the thing is so much of it is very heady. And one of the big things that Freire is so well known for is talking about and pushing on this idea of praxis, the idea of marrying philosophy and practice into the same. And I read that and I went, well, that's improv. Because that's what it teaches you to do, because it allows you to engage in that sense of intuitiveness. And to me, it's like, the how do we do it? Well, we get away from the how. That's how we do it. And I feel like there's this interesting paradox there. And I'd love to kind of turn over to the sort of last bit on this last slide here.
Yeah, when I offer teacher training, side coach trainings. We didn't really talk about side coaching too much, but it's a really important part of the non-authoritarian method, that there is no director. there's just this fellow player, like a third base coach in a softball team, just kind of giving you some help to know, helping you stay on focus and helping you see and hear, but not telling you how to do it. That's an important part of it. So, but when I do side coach trainings, one of the first things I tell them is, and I know I would get in trouble with this from my parents, but you're going to have to adapt this work for your group, no matter what. You're not going to have, like Viola had, like endless time, it seems like, with these groups. You know, you're not going to have the same conditions. You're going to have a group that needs adaptation. And so, but understanding the philosophical underpinnings will help you do that in a way that keeps what's best about it alive and pure, right? And so we read Neva Boyd or talk about Neva Boyd and read the book, and then we feel it's much easier to adapt when you understand the basic, underpinnings of the philosophy.
Yeah. Well,
so I'll leave it with that.
I think I did mention this earlier, but like the philosophy is here. The rest of this is practice.
Yeah.
The rest of this is, these are the games, these are the things you can do, and she tells you, like, these are the kinds of uses and resources that this, and I will say for teachers, the theater games for the classroom is really good at that.
Yeah.
And one more thing that I'd love for you to chime in on, and this is sort of my Q&A a little bit, is one of the big things that I ran into in my dissertation work is that so much, we actually have a lot of stuff around improvisation and education, but it's all focused on, here's improv your kids can do. Here's an activity for your kids, right? Because they're allowed, right? They're allowed to play together.
Right, not you.
And there is this, I have this problem with this, like, but I think that to me it feels very much like the blind leading the blind. It's like, how are you going to, you've got these SEL programs, right, which are all built off of theater game type stuff, right? You have all these SEL programs, and so often it's like, so how is a teacher going to implement this program that they have never had provided for them? And it's kind of, and especially
one thing I'll just add before we go to the Q&A about that is that yes, the first part's philosophy and theory, and then you get into the text, which is the games, and they're organized in order, but Viola said it's hard to read that part. It's like reading a cookbook. Mm-hmm. You can't taste the recipes from reading the cookbook, right? So what you do is, even if you don't understand it, and with Viola, often we don't understand it, you just read from the book and get it up on its feet and play the games with your groups, and you learn that way.
Yeah.
You're and sometimes the group, it's not the game for them. It was too early. It was, it's never like, oh, this game doesn't work. I mean, you just keep trying till you understand what the game is going to help you with, and then you'll find it. Try it with different groups and different. So Viola read from the book, folks. Paul read from the book. So I know some people tell me and they feel like they will look inexperienced if they're reading from the book. I read from the book, So you're allowed to just open it up, read from the book, and play the games. And I think that's really important to do.
And it's great to have these conversations and to get into the philosophy, but I love that when you do a workshop, you just start with games.
You just play.
You just play to begin with. And to me, that's like how I love to interact with students, is I'm like, let's play first, and then let's talk about what seems to be the resonating themes that are meaningful to us and help us engage in philosophy. All right, questions. Okay, actually, I'm going to start out over here real quick.
Could you speak a little bit to what Paul might have meant when he said the American people were beyond satire?
Paul said the soul of the American people is beyond satire. He actually wrote this in his book, Paul Sills' Story Theater for Shows, and it's a beautiful passage. The question was, what did Paul mean by that? And I wish I had, I don't have all the books with me because I'm traveling. He was seeking a theater that could respond to the turbulent events of the 60s, the assassinations, the civil rights movement, the war, and he did not feel that Second City was the place for him to do that at that time. And so he felt the soul of the American people is beyond satire. So he actually, in the game theater, they did a show where they put the Democratic Party on trial for getting them into the Vietnam War. But what he ended up, and that wasn't quite it either for him. Where he ended up finding the response to the time was through the Grimm's fairy tales and adapting them. And people, there were fairy tales about soldiers returning home from the war who were useless to the king and cast out, and then they overcome through, all the wishes and the events involved in a fairy tale. They learned that they had a self and mattered and overcame the patriarchal power. And when he did those fairy tales in 1968, when the Democratic Convention was on in Chicago, people jumped from their seats and shouted "right on," and they found this, he found what he was looking for that way, and he said, that a theater for him that met the needs of the times. And there's another theme in the work that I'll just mention briefly, is that the understanding that you have a self. Paul would talk to us about this a lot, right? The understanding that you have a self means you cannot be ruled. Shakespeare's hidden king, he would talk to us about, and he wrote about, and it's very beautiful. There's a great interview with him where he goes in depth on that as well on the paulsills.com website. I have a show in LAUSD. It's produced by a nonprofit that does theater to inspire learning, and we go play theater games in Title I elementary schools in their cafetoriums and stuff, and it's a 45-minute assembly-length show. We talk about creative problem solving and play and learning through play, and just play a lot of games, and the kids play some games with us. I moved to Sister Bay, Wisconsin, so I'm not in the shows anymore, but the shows, thank goodness, continue. And yeah, I know, someone call me. We'll get it going here too. I wasn't doing story theater with them. We did a game called Building a Story, which is a Spolin game. But there are story theater workshops going on in Door County, Wisconsin this summer for teens. Paul's grandson, May Keene, will be side coaching that. Paul's granddaughter, Freya, will be in it. So that'll be cool. And my mom, Carol Sills, is teaching a story theater intensive this summer in Door County as well.
Yeah, I was just wondering, I'm early in my teaching career, but feel like I'm already starting to run up against this a little bit. If you could just speak about, and you mentioned this a little bit with your quote from Paul about, these are the waters, that we're in, how to navigate teaching in this, non-authoritarian way within institutions and structures that very much like their authoritarianism and want to keep it in place because that's what all of those systems want to do, is to perpetuate that. So I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit about kind of threading that needle.
Yeah. Well, you can grade without grading the creative output, make a rubric that involves anything other than their creative output, like their attendance, that kind of thing. And you can look at the evaluation method and phrase your questions in that way that help them rather than, to help them to see and to notice what's happening in the work rather than critique it from a limited point of view. And you can look at her side coaching, the way she side coaches, the kind of neutral phrases she uses that keep the player on focus and in present time and in process, rather than going, ooh, what did you, and all those things, her beautiful warm-up method that calms us down and helps us enter the present time and see each other, and all those kind of things you can integrate and sneakily. Right?
Yeah, I'd love to jump into that, because that's part of why I'm here and why I'm doing all this work, is because to me that's you're touching on like the big sore point, the big thing of like teachers are taught to do one thing, but then actually in the room have to do another if they care about the outcomes of not some of their students, but all of them. And the problem is that the structural authoritarian model is very much, and just rawly small c capitalist, because there is this kind of breakage, what I call the breakage theory of teaching, which is if you're running a grocery store, you know that a certain amount of pickle jars are just not going to get sold. They're going to fall down, they're going to break, and you just accept that you are going to take a loss on a certain percentage, which when they're pickles is fine. When they're human beings, that's not an option for us as teachers. And I think one of the key things that really informed and led me down this path in education, and that I started having these interactions with students and having teachers come to me after I'd had them for a week going, "What'd you do? So-and-so's doing great in my class, and I haven't been able to get them to do anything." And I'm like, "I don't know, I just treated them like a human being. Don't you do that?" But the thing to me there to focus on is this idea of authenticity. It's not that you don't have boundaries when we improvise. We still have boundaries. And in fact, when you improvise, part of the whole point is that you are validating who you're playing with and going, "Oh, this is what you can or are willing to do. We still want to play a game together, so we're going to figure out how we can both play that game together." And to me, that then allows you to be very honest with students. And they know, man, teenagers especially, now granted, I'm working with high school kids, but their bullshit detector is so sharp. And they are so used to there being so much systemic bullshit. And sometimes they'll push back at you when you're like, "Let's not do that." Because they still know they're stuck within the system. But, and I'm using a very long way of going around, as she said, sneakily, I'm going to say, make your students your co-conspirators. Bring them in, because you are equals trying to navigate the situation in which you still want to do some learning. You still want to engage. And my other suggestion is just structurally, I'm a huge fan of Dungeons and Dragons. And I think every teacher should play Dungeons and Dragons at some point, because if you've ever worked with a module, it tells you the different things that your players are probably going to do. But as the DM, the players are the ones who tell the story. The students tell the story. So if you come in with a lesson plan, let's say it's even chemistry, you have to be in a place where the students have a chance to direct and guide what what actually happens in that space, even when you're like, "I need to guide you to these particular content points," right? And so, when we talk about the idea of railroading and stuff, and then, just go watch some Brennan Lee Mulligan being awesome.
A whole different symposium.
Yeah, and that's another symposium that we will put together if people are here for it.
I mean, if you integrate games and play and story and song, I mean, you will see there's so many games that involve attention giving. Yeah. You'll see such a different level of attention than, if you tell a kid to pay attention and then play a certain type of game, like Who Started the Motion, it's like that. So the more games and play you integrate in sneaky ways, whatever ways, the more you'll see students who weren't participating before participate, who have different ways of learning, different intelligences, the more people you'll reach too. So as Viola said, stories and games bring out self rather than ego.
You can also sell some of this stuff by calling it problem-based learning. We have whole papers on it. And it's,
exactly.
She's all about the problem solving.
Yep.
Okay, we are over time, but I feel like I saw a couple of other people going, hey. So one more, can we do one more? Anybody? Bueller? Okay. I mean, if not, that's fine.
Yeah, they do.
Yes. Hold on, one second.
Hi, I'm Christine Alexander. Hi, Erik.
We haven't actually met in person, but we know each other.
It's very exciting.
It's okay.
Aretha, thank you so much for spending your time with us and sharing so much of your family's history. I'm curious if you have a sense, using your imagination, if Viola were with us now, What might she want to offer in this particular moment, historically, like, however you want to take this, like wherever your brain goes to first. I'm just curious what you think, like what her voice would bring.
I mean, I think she really understood this work went way beyond theater. That was very, very clear to her. A student who worked with her at the end of her life told me she was kind of more interested in working outside the theater at that point and reaching anybody who needed it. And so back to the social work roots of improvisational theater, right? And so I certainly think, again, she said kindergarten for the 21st century. She wanted this work to be in every school around the world. That's what she would want.
Thank you all so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you.
It's an absolute dream come true.